Now I'll start sharing the screen. There we are. And
they were not drones. A drone was a dumb thing that was towed by an aircraft as a top.
amazing, thank you.
No, you're not called a drone.
So here you are. And you got the slideshow there. I mean,
Great.
that's your show
Do
now.
I need to? So do I need to just? Should I just click slideshow?
Yeah, it's slideshow. You have a mouse here. I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, no, that's it.
Ah, there you have a slide here, you know, slideshow, whatever. But hello everybody. It's 4:30. We'll start in a moment. We have the very good luck of having here Emily Rose Baker, who's going to talk about creaturely fear, Holocaust horror, and memory beyond the human. And Emily is a postdoc from the University of Southampton. She's in the English department, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
And she's researching this field. So without, taking much more time from you, let's start giving the floor to Emily, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. And our other Emily Stiles, is going to be chairing that session. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Do you need me to stand right here for the camera?
Yes. Let's see how Teams is doing for us, because sometimes, yes, if you look at where am I here,
Perfect.
hopefully it should be there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let me just. Oh, I keep forgetting there's a mouse here.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, brilliant. It's working. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much, Emily, for inviting me. I'm sorry that I'm not James, who we thought was initially going to give this talk because of some misinformation on the University of Southampton's website. But I'm really pleased to be here. It's the first time I've been on campus here at Winchester, and it's really beautiful. So I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to get straight into things. Just to say before we start that I think the advertised talk said that I was going to talk about 3 films today. It turns out I have so much to say about the films that I'm only going to talk about 2 of them, so that I don't overrun. So I hope that's okay with everyone. I guess just wary of time. Okay, so as has already been said, I work in the English department at Southampton University, but my postdoctoral research mainly focuses on Holocaust film. So my current postdoctoral project examines Holocaust cinema through the generic lens of horror, which involves thinking through the ways in which horrific experiences of genocidal violence and suffering taps into, borrows from, and has itself informed the horror genre. Given the preoccupation of horror with more than human figures and elements, such as monsters and the supernatural, as well as the recent turn to the non-human within Holocaust representation and memorialisation, a significant strand of this research relates to narrative and formal deviations from the human in Holocaust film. As such, this talk will consider the role of animals in filmic works of the Holocaust, which deploy formal and narrative conventions associated with the horror genre. Drawing on emerging scholarship on the animal derivation of art and paradigms of animal witnessing, it examines the unusual depiction of Jewish murder in 2 Holocaust films. Juraj Herz is The Cremator, released in 1969, and Jonathan Glazer's recent movie, The Zone of Interest. In doing so, it considers how the register of horror, in addition to animal lives and aesthetics in these films, complicate and offer generative alternatives to conventional forms of Holocaust memory and witnessing. I begin the talk by addressing the mutual influence of horror and Holocaust cinema before analysing the operation of more than human lives and aesthetics within the 2 films. I end by considering how reading these films through a horror frame or lens can help us move beyond limitations of focusing on the human as a basis for the humane in representations of the Holocaust, which have long been shaped by a strictly humanising impulse. So I first began thinking about the overlap between Holocaust representation and the horror genre when, during my PhD, I came across a spate of post-communist Polish texts and films dealing with the wartime murder of Polish Jews by their non-Jewish neighbours via an explicit engagement with tropes and motifs associated with horror and the Gothic. These works follow a similar narrative formula in which undead Jews return to Poland in the form of zombies, spectral presences, and ghostly hauntings to unveil the extent of local collaboration during the Holocaust. They include Anka and Wilhelm Sasnal's 2011 film, It Looks Pretty from a Distance, and here are some stills from the film on screen, in which the wartime misdeeds of an unnamed rural Polish community resurface via haunted forests and pastoral landscapes, such as those on screen, which become vicarious witnesses and carriers of memory. The film's invocation of landscapes and plant life as irrevocably, that's a difficult word, altered by the memory of Jewish murder, draws attention to the possibilities afforded by ecology and discourses of eco-criticism as a methodological approach and aesthetic mode of remembering and representing the Holocaust in the very places it's been forgotten. Works like It Looks Pretty from a Distance contributed to a growing body of scholarship, literature, and film dealing with unwelcome memories of Polish complicity and collaboration in the Holocaust, which came to public attention with the publication of historian Jan T. Gross's controversial study, Neighbours, in the year 2000. And this text exposed the massacre of the Jewish population of a village called Jedwabne by their Polish neighbours in the summer of 1941, and sparked extensive public as well as scholarly debates about Polish-Jewish relations and the legacy of Polish co-perpetration in the murder and dispossession of Jews during Holocaust years. Although some of these literary and filmic texts have been criticised for re-victimising the Jewish dead only to bring closure to this difficult past, they nonetheless gesture, I think, I'm going to argue, towards the legibility of horror as a unique means of narrativizing the Holocaust, a distinctly horrific event. For the Holocaust is inextricably connected to the horror genre and to horror film in particular. An event so horrific it continues to elude representation, Brian E. Krim argues that the Holocaust has set the standard for the horror genre in the modern era. The Third Reich and its collaborators transformed the landscape of Europe into one of death, implementing technologies of murder and suffering on such a scale that they required a new language of genocide. In their immediate aftermath, these events were invoked as unprecedented horrors. Nazi perpetrators were rendered monstrous incarnations of evil, and images of zombie-like musclemen and piles of human corpses abounded in newspapers and liberation footage. Such images would not only come to serve as enduring Holocaust icons in post-war representations of the event, but would shape the aesthetic and political registers of horror in foundational ways, particularly within modern cinema, which Antoine de Bac argues was born out of concentrationary images. Yet the foundation of horror's relationship to the Holocaust, the foundations rather, were laid even before the rise of the Third Reich in the 1930s, with Weimar cinema foreshadowing Nazi eugenics and anti-Semitic propaganda. German expressionist films of the 1920s, for example, instrumentalized aesthetics and figures associated with the Gothic, a subgenre or predecessor of horror, as a means of articulating anti-Semitic sensibilities and anxieties. With his hooked nose and ritualized sucking of blood, the titular vampire of F.W. Murnau's 1922 Nosferatu on the left, a silent film, for example, is imbued with anti-Semitic tropes which reappear in Fritz Hippler's infamous 1940 Nazi propaganda film, The Eternal Jew. As scholars have observed, Nosferatu conveyed interwar anxieties over Jews infecting the body politic of the German nation. The idea of the Jew as a proto-vampiric blood-sucking parasite rooted in Christian accusations of Jewish blood libel. In the post-war period, depictions of the Holocaust have drawn heavily from the audiovisual language of horror, configuring dark, suspenseful narratives that elicit fear and vicarious trauma. This includes well-known works like Schindler's List, whose depiction of women's bodies Omar Bartov deems more appropriate to a soft porn sadomasochistic film, a still of which is on the left of the screen. Laszlo Nemes's 2015 film Son of Saul in the middle there, which builds a disturbing picture of the murderously ethically complicated work of a Hungarian Sonderkommando member. and the portrayal of Nazis as zombies in Nazi exploitation films like Night of the Zombies, a 1981 movie, and Dead Snow, pixelated but still kind of horrific stuff from the film from 2008. Horror is particularly well suited to convey these narratives of extreme suffering precisely because it deals with themes of violence and killing, grief, guilt, and societal fears. In short, the genre's investment in envisaging horrific misdeeds makes it a suitable framework for depicting events that we can only imagine. At the same time, the Holocaust has become a reference point for all other kinds of evil and their representation. Holocaust imagery and narratives proliferate in cultural texts belonging to horror, even those with no ostensible link to the event, such as Psycho, whose protagonist, based on the Nazi-influenced serial killer Ed Gein, exemplifies the banal quality of evil Hannah Arendt observed in her writings on the Eichmann trial 1 year after the film's release. So before moving on to my filmic examples, I want to note two final elements which render the horror genre particularly well placed for representing Holocaust narratives. While horror is a popular cultural genre primarily concerned with entertaining audiences, horror films are also inherently transgressive, engaged in political work, and seeking to channel social fears. They're also inherently effective, designed to elicit particular emotions and sensations. And it's significant, it is the political kernel of horror in conjunction with its effective impulse, I think, which comes to play a significant role in the films under discussion today, and which allows these works to challenge and helpful victim-perpetrator dyads and to bring audiences into ethical relation with their narratives in particularly embodied ways. Okay, so on to my first example. So the films I'm going to discuss today, The Cremator and The Zone of Interest, demonstrate the varied guises of horror in Holocaust cinema. They were each released in different decades, emerged from different national contexts, and possess strikingly different formal and stylistic registers. However, they both harness elements of the horror genre, as well as an investment in the more than human ways in which Holocaust cinema can challenge conventional modes of representation. My first filmic example is The Cremator, directed by Ravensbrück survivor Juraj Herz in 1969. The Cremator is a dark comedy horror whose unusual depiction of Jewish murder complicates the abiding divisions characterizing Holocaust studies, those of victim and perpetrator, but also of human and animal. Set in Prague after the city's occupation by German forces in 1938, the film follows deranged cremator turned Nazi sympathizer Karel, whose gradual recruitment into Nazism culminates in the brutal murder and cremation of those he deems unworthy of life. And there is the protagonist, the cremator, Karel, on screen, including his Jewish wife, children, and employees. The more deeply ingrained the patriarch's Nazi convictions become, the more fervently he commits acts of murder in his crematorium, which becomes a cogent referent for industrialized Holocaust murder. Actions justified throughout the film via the repeated mantra that cremation, including that of animals, frees the soul. Based on a novel of the same name by non-Jewish Czech writer Ladislav Fuchs, and based in the Soviet Union and banned, in the Soviet Union between 1974 and 1989, the film produces a form of creatural consciousness or aesthetic. This involves the on-screen presence of animals, in addition to formally non-anthropocentric elements, which come to express the uncanny animality of the Holocaust. The phrase Anat Pick uses to refer to the ways in which the Third Reich's pursuit of racial purity claims the human itself as an embattled and unstable zone. The application of this term within the context of the Holocaust is particularly provocative, since it not only brackets non-human and human life together, but hints at a certain animalization of or dehumanization of the human, and conversely, a certain humanization of the animal. However, I argue here that the Cremator's non-human register is central to its subversive articulation of Holocaust killing, as well as the absurdity of life in the post-war and communist periods. So Carrie Roman argues that rather than an exclusively human form of cognition, art actually has its origins in the animal and connects the human profoundly to other creatures. So this is the basis of her idea of creatural consciousness, or the creatural consciousness in art. According to this view, humans are but the most recent evolutionary iteration of artistic agents whose aesthetic practices we have inherited from animal cultures, and drives, from the attraction of mates through song and dance to the creation of aesthetically pleasing habitats. The more than human roots of art are particularly prevalent within surrealist modes of expression, which, based in an aesthetic politics of strangeness and excess, often emphasize the animality of human experience to subvert the logos of Western aesthetic thought. Proponents of surrealism turn to animals as well as dreams for aesthetic and intellectual inspiration, both helping to expand the parameters of rational human thought due to the experiences of otherness they offer. Manifesting in uncanny images and objects imbued with symbolic and often paradoxical meanings, such otherness is particularly encapsulated within cinema, which, according to James Carhill, is uniquely able to induce surrealism on account of its inherently zoological quality. Understanding artistic impulses as borrowed in some sense from animals and the natural world challenges the predominantly anthropocentric modes of Holocaust art and film, which tend toward upholding simplistic binaries of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, as a means of imparting specific moral lessons. For example, in Schindler's List, perhaps the best-known Holocaust film, a Nazi industrialist sacrifices his life in order to save 1,000 or over 1,000 Polish Jewish workers marked for Auschwitz, enacting an ultimate restoration of humanity and the humane as a basis for morality. The Cremator instrumentalizes narrative and formal processes of animalization and dehumanization to situate Holocaust experiences within broader configurations of otherness, revealing the processes by which lives arbitrarily perceived as inferior are othered through a logic of species, including Jews and non-human animals. In the film, violent acts of murder resonate across species, and the human appears as a fragile construct, while dark comedy, horror motifs, and formal evocations of animality become the dominant frames through which the final solution is depicted on screen. So creaturely orientations in the Cremator also draw attention to how Soviet-era directors, unable to comprehensively depict Jewish suffering, engage with its legacy. Even in the 1960s, which signaled a period of liberalization for Czechoslovak politics and film. For the Cremator belongs to a new wave of cinema in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, which developed uniquely in relation to communism and culminated in the proliferation of unusual feature films dealing with the Holocaust and Jewish suffering, such as those on screen. While the aggressive anti-Semitism of Stalinism in the 1960s prevented films which diverged from the official interpretation of the past, a policy involving no exceptions for the Holocaust, the reform politics of the mid-1960s in Czechoslovakia offered relative freedom within the film industry. This culminated in the proliferation of subversive expressionistic films, including the spate of Holocaust films, of which there are about 12 feature films produced in the period, from 1963 until the Prague Spring of 1968, when Soviet-led armies of the Warsaw Pact marched into Prague to curb reformist activity. These films drew upon surreal and absurd aesthetics to reject the requirements of socialist realism, the Soviet film policy which demanded optimistic depictions of anything communist and condemned formalist elements that called attention to the making of the film rather than the story itself. Unlike New Wave films emerging elsewhere in Europe, however, such as the French New Wave, those deriving from socialist Czechoslovakia engaged differently with surrealist ideas due to the profound divergence in their cultural and historical origins, as well as the specificity of the communist experience. Diverging from its French counterpart, here surrealism was characterized by black humor and the use of irony and absurdism to undermine totalizing ideology. I'm going to get now into some kind of close readings of the film. So in the Cremator, the presence and occasional killing of non-human animals serves as a visual precursor to that of Jews, who are animalized through audiovisual associations with the creaturely so that they may be unceremoniously killed. At the same time, the eponymous Cremator undergoes a process of animalization of his own that is linked with his becoming Nazi. Yet the film's creaturely register, and indeed its horror, stems not only from the entangled fates of its human and non-human animal subjects, but from their imbrication within an unsettling creatural aesthetic operating at the level of form and mise-en-scène. The creaturely configuration of the Cremator is signalled from its opening sequence, in which a fast-paced montage juxtaposes extreme close-ups of Carol's face with those of exotic animals behind bars at a zoo. Alternately filling the frame, the lines on Carol's magnified forehead replicate the curvature of a slithering snake. His shifting eyes are mapped onto those of a lion, and his mechanically undulating mouth is replaced in a series of images I haven't included on the slide by the sharp teeth of a yawning leopard. Two further shots concretize the film's early association of the human with creatureliness and emphasize the underpinning of Carol's ideological sensibility by a species hierarchy which implicates his own children as Jews. Shot from the perspective of the encaged animals, Carol's teenage children, Zena and Millie, appear as though caged themselves in the first of these images on the left, climbing on the bars of animal enclosures and growling like little beasts, as Adam Schofield observes. Cages are for dumb creatures, Carol remarks with a smile, foreshadowing the untimely demise of his children. The sequence closes with a claustrophobic fish-eye perspective of the family reflected in a convex mirror, as you can see here on the screen on the right, resulting in a distorted portrait that disrupts their bodily proportions. Reminiscent of funhouse mirrors, hemispherical images like this one recur throughout the film and signal its surreal sensibility. Here, both the Cremator and his family are ambiguously animalized, which not only draws associative links between Carol and the unpredictable threat of predatory animals, so the lion, the snake, the leopard, but implicates his children in this metaphor. However, the wild gesticulations of his children resonate more with the movements of apes than stealthy predators. Despite resembling humans the most, apes and other simians have consistently been perceived as aggressive and racially other within Western culture and have been objectified according to an impression of perverse eroticism. Stemming from anxieties over evolutionary science and the ancestral relationship of humans to the primates, claims Boris Sachs, the wrinkled faces, lack of human speech, narrow foreheads, and difficulty walking upright associated with simians simultaneously imbues them with a certain infancy and senility. This disparaging image of simians in the white imaginary coheres most obviously with the racist discrimination of Black people, who have been depicted as sexually unrestrained and violent and associated with a language of exoticism and disease. While Jews have more commonly been maligned by their association with rats and insects, vermin, Sachs links simianization to anti-Semitic caricature. The proverbial Jew, he claims, was depicted from the Middle Ages as an old but foolish man whose perceived Semitic features include the hairiness, short legs, dark eyes, and monstrously large head shared by apes. By transforming his Jewish children into primitive caricatures, Herz indicates Carol's conformity to the logics of speciesism, invoking the cartoonization of Jews as less than human in the kind of virulent anti-Semitic propaganda he would have been painfully aware of, having grown up in Central Europe in the 1930s. The Cremator's creaturely register operates differently in a later sequence, in which Carol accompanies his family to a wax museum of famous murderers at the local fun fair, where residents gather to watch uncannily lifelike mannequins perform violent episodes from history. The sequence begins with the carnivalesque portrayal of the fair, through which Herz metaphorizes the absurdity and grotesque reality of life under the Third Reich. Before taking us into the dark interior of the Wax Museum, the camera cuts at speed between images typical of the 1930s fairground scene, including a whirring carousel, balloons, carnival games, the jerky movements of dated animatronics, and performing acrobats animated by a haunting melody. These images disorient viewers and are juxtaposed with close-ups of Xena, Millie, and Carol's wife, Lakme's serene expressions as they enjoy their surroundings. Carol appears disgruntled by contrast, ominously declaring, "I have something much better for you." He ushers his family into the dark museum. And I will explain these kind of bizarre images in a second. Bear in mind that it's a surrealist film. Played by actors covered in wax, the mannequins populating the museum blur the boundary between reality and fiction, as well as human and non-human. Characterized by lifeless eyes, mechanical movements, and greasy translucent skin, they are reminiscent of the living dead corpses of the concentration camp universe. The historical reenactments include a man who had the plague and chose to end his own life rather than contaminate others, and a murdered serial killer who we are told looked innocent due to his Aryan features. These images signal the film's engagement with the disturbing idea that murder can be liberating and morally comprehensible, and with discourses of disease reminiscent of those used in Nazi propaganda to vilify Jews. Well, and so I should point out here that there's this blurring between the mannequins as wax and it's human, and the mannequins actually bleed. So there's this kind of confusion, this erosion of the boundary between the human and non-human. While Carol smiles disturbingly at the violent museum displays, the crowds watch on, gasping in horror at the all-too-human figures, but compelled to look. Left side of the screen, you can see this kind of spectacle unfold. The only dissenting voice derives from an unnamed woman whose hysterical commentary we're invited to laugh at, and whose husband mocks her for questioning the inanimacy of the waxworks. She recognizes the victim from the first murder scene, and upon witnessing the last murder reenactment, she shouts, "He's alive!" before being ushered away by her disparaging husband. The off-kilter museum environment intensifies as Carol is led by the museum director into a special exhibit filled with jars. Sorry, these are particularly grim images. Led into a special exhibit filled with jars of preserved fetuses and dismembered body parts labelled with contagious diseases. These jars are lit up sporadically in time with the haunting score as Carol inspects them, his face distorted as he passes behind the magnifying glass jars, gesturing towards his warped psyche and his declining ethical sensibility. One striking shot, the one on the left there, shows the reflected image of Carol sticking out his tongue to mimic the lifeless expression of an embalmed fetus behind glass, before commenting, "But modern medical science can protect us from all this." A clear echo of Nazi eugenicist thinking. I'll move this on back to you before we move on to prevent you from having to look at that while I speak. Herz's mannequins are uncannily humanized in their lifelike movements and bodily functions. The embalmed fetuses and body parts, meanwhile, are dehumanized by their dismemberment and voyeuristic display. By questioning the human status of these subjects, the film blurs and renders arbitrary distinctions across different forms of identity, including ethnicity, ability, and species. In doing so, it constructs an ethical spectrum based in a critique not only of insidious discourses of eugenics and speciesism, but of remaining silent in the face of violence perpetrated against precarious lives. This includes the lives of mannequins, not as inferior versions of the human, but as subjects worthy of ethical consideration. By suggesting that all living beings are united in their mortality, in the fact that the mannequins bleed, these subjects subvert the biopolitical fantasy of racial essentialism, according to which Jews are rendered unworthy of life. In its reflexively artificial staging of processes of onlooking and bystanding, the sequence also metaphorizes the culpability of those who witnessed the perpetration of Holocaust violence and did nothing, and directly implicates viewers, ourselves, in the dubious ethics of this watching. Challenging the master narrative of Czechoslovak Jewish coexistence, Herz implicitly addresses the question of Czechoslovak collaboration, a taboo topic under socialism which remains underexplored despite documented local participation in the administration of concentration camps and the deportation and killing of over 250,000 Jews who had resided in the Czechoslovak Republic in 1938. Viewers are at once encouraged to find voyeuristic enjoyment in the scene's grotesque displays of violence and rendered complicit in the gendered silencing of the unnamed woman by her husband, which invokes the silencing of dissenting voices during the Holocaust, as well as the dangers of Soviet-era censorship. The exaggerated theatricality of this sequence foregrounds Carol's own fascination with violence coded as anti-Semitic, gesturing toward the dynamic of compulsion and revulsion lying at the center of both the horror genre and fascism more broadly. So from the film's beginning, cremation metaphorizes and foreshadows the final solution. Specific images associated with the final solution punctuate the film and alert viewers to its political commentary, including the crematorium itself, abundant references to furnaces, and the metal cylinders containing the ashes of the deceased, which resemble canisters of Zyklon B. These invocations of the final solution entangle the humans, animals, and other subjects bound by Carol's murderous preoccupations. Making references to the shared fates of humans and animals throughout the film, the Cremator is obsessed not only with the cremation of animals as well as humans, including, he talks multiple times about cremating the family cat, Roxana, but with the idea of reincarnation. The belief that the human soul may begin a new life after biological death and occupy an animal body, and vice versa, makes fluid the boundaries between species. This is exemplified by the shared terms of endearment, enchantress and angel, used by Carol throughout the film to refer to Roxana, his cat, and Lakme, his wife. So there's this interchanging of these terms of endearment. It's very disturbing. Yet it is Lakme, not Roxana, who falls victim to the cremator. Lakme's murder is situated within a series of ambiguous imagistic references to animal death in the film and predation that mirror the isolated close-ups of animal bodies in the film's opening montage. Unceremoniously hanged by her husband, Lakme is led into the family bathroom, where Carol guides her onto a stool and into a noose hanging from the ceiling, asking disturbingly, "What if I hang you up among the other angels?" Again, the use of angel uniting his Jewish wife and cat. As he does so, I'm not showing you the hanging. The camera puts the viewer first in the place of the victim, looking down at Carol, this image on the right, and then in that of the perpetrator, returning Lakme's gaze from below. And I'll move this on again so that you don't have to look at it. As the chair is removed from underneath her, the camera cuts to Roxana's face and back to Lakme. The cat plays with the ties on Lakme's right shoe as she's suspended in midair before drinking milk underneath her lifeless feet. Directly preceding Lakme's murder is a scene of two carps being hammered to death off screen. We don't see this violence, with a mallet by the family housekeeper. An extreme close-up of a carp eye and gaping mouth signals the beginning of their demise. Held by Carol's children beside the filled tub of the family bathroom, the fish struggle for breath. Carol prompts Millie and Zena, his children, not to make them suffer, as the housemaid cheerily enters the bathroom, mallet in hand. Before vacating the room, Millie is instructed to leave Roxana, the cat, behind to, quote, enjoy the guts. Indicative of the broader inconsistency of his engagement with ideas about suffering, the disparity between Carol's call to prevent the suffering of the fish and what unfolds in the scene, the murder of his wife, is a product of his cognitive dissonance. He perceives death as a merciful act of preventing suffering, especially preventing suffering of Jews, as he says, but does not seem concerned with the suffering that precedes a prematurely induced death. The scene hence emerges as a kind of surreal intensification of broader paternal logics of the humane, which are often used to justify animal suffering. These images are inherently ambiguous, as well as disturbing, seeming on the one hand to conflate collaborationist perpetrators and Jews with animality in the guise of murderous predator and helpless animal, and on the other to invert conventional species hierarchies by placing some animals above other animal as well as human lives. This complex entanglement of human and animal is concretized in the film's final sequence, which follows Carol's murder of his teenage son in the coffin-filled crematorium by striking him with a metal rod. Carol is appointed by a Nazi commander to supervise his own final solution at the end of the film, though it's never expressed in such explicit terms. The camera slowly approaches Carol, who stands authoritatively at the end of a long boardroom table in front of a panel depicting hell from Hieronymus Bosch's 15th century painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, as though an embodiment of hell himself. Having become obsessed with Tibetan mysticism, this contrasts Carol's own self-image as an angel of mercy figure whose role it is to alleviate all infected others, including Jews, from suffering through death. Alluding to the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution was decided by high-ranking Nazi officials, Carol delivers a soft-spoken speech at this boardroom table about the efficiency with which he can turn the greatest possible number of Jewish souls to ash. The camera betrays this total descent into the cremator's madness through a series of disorientating shots, of which the two on screen are examples, one of which captures Carol's head and shoulders upside down in the reflection of the glass table. As Carol's pathological monologue continues, a montage comprising grotesque close-ups of Bosch's painting fills the frame, including those depicting anti-Semitic caricature, which are intercut with monstrous animal figures. Accompanied by an unsettling choral track, the viewer assumes Carol's perspective as he looks down at the prospective victims of industrialized murder, whom he names one at a time, including his Jewish neighbor, Dr. Bettelheim. And they kind of fall into this black void with their arms outstretched as he names them one at a time, as a metaphor for a different kind of final solution. This alternative rendering of the final solution, which replaces its reproduction with absurd imagistic associations to a creaturely underworld, relies on the viewer to build our own image of industrialized Holocaust killing in a manner commensurate with horror's privileging of imagined violence. Resisting narrative closure, this ending is uncertain, compounded by the suggestion of Zena's escape in the film's final minutes and by the unreliability of Carol's perspective. So I'm now going to move on to my second example, the zone of interest, which more of you might be familiar with. So opting for a much more realistic aesthetic, the zone of interest contrasts with the cremator's surrealist, inflected horror register, yet is no less disturbing. Glazer's film centers the lives of Auschwitz survivors, of Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Herz and his wife Hedwig, as they strive to cultivate an idyllic home for their family, while the horrors of the camp persist just beyond its walls. And on the left here is a family shot of his family in the early 1940s. While horror in the Cremator is cultivated by the protagonist's obsession with cremation, his animalization and killing of his Jewish family, and the film's distorted, off-kilter environment, the zone of interest's engagement with the horror genre is much more understated. Here, the horrors of the Holocaust are banal, and viewers are prevented from seeing the world of the camp, which are hinted at through the film's soundscape and occasional glimpses of smoke from chimneys. But while prisoners are hidden from view in the film, fauna of all kinds proliferate, with animal sightings punctuating its human action. However, the near omnipresence of one animal figure in particular is particularly significant. That of Dilla, a black Weimaraner who you can see just looking out from this image on the right, who doubles up as the family dog and the personal pet of Sandra Hüller, the German actor who portrays Hedwig Höss. While Glazer invokes human murder and persecution in Auschwitz orally rather than visually, Diller is present in almost every scene of the film, operating as a more than human cinematic and testimonial device, bridging the domestic world of the Herz family home and the horrific universe of the camp. Diller, in this sense, becomes an ambivalent form of animal witness to events audiences are left to imagine. As cinematic animal witness, Huller's dog not only transgresses the divide between the camp and the home in the film, but between fiction and non-fiction, imbuing her with a degree of testimonial authority. As pet and guard dog, she also serves as a referent for Nazi sentiment surrounding animal kinship with selected species, occupying a privileged position in comparison to the non-domestic animals populating the film, including insects, birds, and a wild boar. Check how we're doing for time. With this, Glazer complicates the conventionally humanistic use of animals and animality in representations of the Holocaust as metaphors for illustrating human-animal difference only. In his recent article on wolves as witnesses to the Holocaust in the memoirs of Misha de Fonseca, which were eventually proven to be false, Andrew Barrett theorizes a form of literary animal witnessing. In de Fonseca's memoirs, Barrett argues, the pack of wolves said to have accompanied the author across Europe as a Jewish child escaping Nazi-occupied Belgium become vehicles for demonstrating the horrors of the Holocaust precisely because they are not human. In this context, Barrett defines animal witnessing as a depiction of animals that uses their difference from humans to attest to the dignity of the human subject, as well as the inhumanity of the Holocaust. While Barrett's analysis of these unusual witnesses is compelling, his definition of animal witnessing risks reproducing the very humanism he seeks to problematize by limiting itself to the operation of representational animal figures without connecting these to real fauna as witnesses to genocide, both during the Holocaust itself and in filmic reproductions of the event. A more complex mode of animal witnessing, then, is presented to viewing publics in the zone of interest, I argue, one which centres real animal witnesses exercising a degree of agency within as well as beyond the diegesis, in addition to formal deviations from the human. The kind of seeing enacted by real animal subjects in cinematic works of the Holocaust operates on two levels, that of the film's narrative realm and of its production. This dual witnessing is exemplified in Glazer's film, in which Diller's own diegetic and extra-diegetic zones of interest are entangled. These include the Herz family and the world of the camp, and her own animal drives and relationship with Huller. We first encounter Diller in the verdant gardens of the Herz family home. This is the first time we see the dog, lying behind Hedwig as her children present a canoe to their father, Rudolf, for his birthday. Viewers are instantly made aware of Diller's role as both beloved pet and a agential witness to the events unfolding around her. Positioned on the grass behind Hedwig, we are afforded a side view of the dog, who watches the scene unfold and responds, whether organically or on command by the director, to Rudolf as he speaks, her head tilting upwards at the sound of his voice. Once the Herz children leave for school, Diller lingers at Hedwig's feet, drifting in and out of the frame as the mother tends to flowers fertilized with cremated human ashes. Never straying far from Rudolf, Hedwig, or the children, the constancy of Diller's on-screen presence gestures towards her privileged place at the nucleus of Nazi family life, as well as her proximity to the violence hovering figuratively as well as visually at the film's edges. While they never owned a dog, animals in the natural world formed an integral part of the real Herz family, whose pets included two turtles, one named Jumbo and another named Diller. It's the name Diller. So Diller the turtle, the tortoise, I forget which, has been replaced by Diller the dog. Although one could be forgiven for overlooking her role as a secondary character in the film, Diller sees all and reveals crucial information about the tapestry of domestic Nazi living, from the compassion with which pets are treated to the intimate entanglement of parental responsibilities with the administration of genocidal violence committed just meters away. While we are never invited to view the diegesis through Diller's perspectival view, in the sense that we don't inhabit her gaze, audiences mirror her testimonial look in some capacity as quiet observers to the events unfolding on screen. The key difference here, however, is that Diller is not a passive witness, but engages with the stage violence surrounding her as a more than human agent of disruption. Paraphrasing from his interview with Huller, so the actress playing Hedwig, David Canfield describes the dog running around and creating dysfunction on set amid Glazer's controlled portrait of evil, suggesting that this disruptive agency was not always performed, but rather owed to Diller's, or the dog's, animal behaviorisms and instincts. Huller not only confirms that her dog was untrained, but she also tells Canfield she's her own dog personality, she's not part of me. Owing to her very animality, the dog cannot be controlled on screen and brushes up against the film's distant and clinical viewpoint. With this, she draws attention to the constructedness of the filmic narrative and exposes the fallacy that Nazi genocide was always characterized by rapid industrialized killings, an image Timothy Snyder argues is too simple and clean. Operating on diegetic and extra-diegetic planes simultaneously, the dog fully belongs neither to the fictive world of the film nor its non-fictional counterpart. Her value in this sense is neither wholly metaphorical nor compounded by her inability to give a spoken account of what she sees, for the instinctual nature of the responses of hers to the film's stage mechanisms of genocide don't diminish her witnessing power. So rather than fading into the background, Diller observes and emphasizes insidious moments of Nazi camaraderie, genocidal planning, and the perpetration of murder in the film, both directly and indirectly. She greets Rudolph as he returns from the camp with bloodied boots. She cries when a group of camp commandants toast his health and his birthday, and barks in response to the sounds of gunshots and guard dogs beyond the camp perimeter, often running in their direction. In such instances, Diller directs viewers towards the source of human violence and alerts us to its unrelenting perpetration, linking the worlds of camp and home, victim and perpetrator, and emphasizing their spatial proximity. At times, she appears to be the only character who notices these instances of sonically rendered brutality. At others, she is reprimanded for reacting to them, whether because her barks interrupt human conversation or because they draw attention to the inconvenient operations of the camp itself. These moments of human-animal interaction evidence Diller's power as a family member and witness, capable of registering what's going on around her, including malign activities within the house. One such activity takes place when Hedwig receives a package containing items of clothing and other personal belongings dispossessed of female Jewish prisoners, one of the many ways in which she benefits economically from genocide. When the woman shuts herself in the bedroom to try on an appropriated fur coat, the coat on the left, Diller cries and scratches at the door, drawing attention to Hedwig's desire for privacy during this moment of otherwise quiet complicity. Just beyond the door's threshold, Diller is not seen but heard. She's constantly scratching at the door and barking during the sequence. She's not seen but heard, defying Hedwig's instructions to go downstairs. We hear her pause on the hardwood floor as her real as well as fictive owner, Huller and/or Hedwig, paints a stolen lipstick onto her mouth in the mirror of her vanity. Diller's protestations during this sequence exemplify her testimonial role, for they amplify and metaphorize Hedwig's wish to shut out a grotesque reality, that she dons the possessions of victims that she's indirectly put to death. While the dog's protestations in the sequence may well derive from the forced separation from Huller, as in her actual owner outside of the film, Diller's physical obstruction from view in this moment paradoxically exemplifies her elevated testimonial role. Shutting the dog out of her room, Hedwig appears to perceive the gaze of the animal as one imbued with potential moral force. Diller's anxiety to access Hedwig's room can also be read metaphorically as a form of resistance both to the Jewish prisoner to whom the coat and lipstick belong, and to the dead animal whose fur lines the coat. Regardless of her privileged domesticated position in the Herz household, then, as an animal subject, Diller shares something fundamental with these marginalized others. These instinctual and at times disruptive behaviors of the dog lend the film, a kind of spatio-temporal animality, resonating with Laura McMahon's concept of animal time, which attends to the relationship of animal life to the moving image. This conception of time derives from Deleuze's cinema of the time image, a term designating works of cinema that develop a direct presentation of time, untied from narrative logic and cause and effect. In McMahon's formulation, animal time is concerned with actual animals rather than imagined ones, who are characterized by a directionless aesthetic. And I guess I want to, there we go. A directionless aesthetic, inescapably present before the camera as cinema makes manifest a particular desire to bear witness to the lived, embodied, material conditions of animal lives. So while animal lives aren't the focus of the zone of interest, the film nonetheless retains a live action animal dimension via its inclusion of Diller, one which variously intervenes within the film's narrative and audiovisual registers. So often appearing, as she does here, to be tracking a particular scent or noise, Diller's wandering in and out of the frame throughout the film resembles something of the directionless aesthetic that McMahon describes. And what's interesting, at least to me here, is that in trying to find it, I could barely find any stills of the film which include Diller. Often the shot is cut, which sort of suggests that whether film critics or historians, people writing about the film, aren't concerned with her at all and often actually don't notice her presence. This aesthetic is on the one hand indicative, I think, of the film's indebtedness to depicting the entanglement of Holocaust killing with the mundane and the everyday for the Herz family, and in this sense appears to be in keeping with its narrative and cinematographic priorities. Given only so much of Diller's behaviour can be controlled, however, as a dog with her own behavioural instincts, her directionlessness, on the other hand, defies the fictional order of the film and introduces an element of non-narrative time. Enabled by her very presence, this formal animal intervention in the film lays bare the asymmetries of biopolitical power at the centre of its narrative. Although a transgressive filmic agent in her testimonial capacity and her live action status, Diller's life is nonetheless managed by Rudolf and Hedwig, who own her and attempt to control her behaviour throughout the film in a way that again illuminates the Nazi regulation of and sovereignty over the lives and deaths of Jewish prisoners beyond the war. Okay, I'm coming to the end. So elsewhere in the film, Diller's benevolent treatment by the Herz family exemplifies favourable Nazi attitudes towards some forms of pet ownership despite their public disdain for it. A scene in which Rudolf informs Hedwig that the family is being transferred to Oranienburg conveys such attitudes particularly well. The conversation takes place during a family garden party where Diller chases the children around as they play in the pool and is caught attempting to steal cake from the picnic table. Dressed in a monochromatic white suit and sitting on a sun chair, Rudolf tenderly strokes Diller's head as he delivers the news to his wife, the dog poised quietly at his feet. Diller and Rudolf appear as foils in this striking image, the canine's glossy black fur contrasting with her owner's white suit, a symbolic inversion, perhaps, of their roles as innocent witness and malignant perpetrator. Signalling one of the only moments in which Rudolf expresses compassion in the film, his display of affection towards Diller here exemplifies the unique place occupied by dogs in the Nazi imaginary. On the one hand, although they enjoyed a degree of legal protection, animals in the Third Reich were generally perceived as inferior to humankind. This is reflected in the Nazi rejection of pet ownership on the basis of companionship, which was seen to cultivate softer emotions and reflected an emphasis on individual autonomy, and thus stood in opposition to the values of National Socialism. On the other, animals with biological qualities deemed desirable were highly regarded and granted an elevated place in the national community. Dogs, and particularly romanticized Germanic breeds, of which Diller is one, were treated with honor by Nazis, whose biopolitical hierarchization of life extended to animals, the breeding of which first produced the concepts of race and of pure blood, central to Nazi eugenics. As Sachs observes in his well-known study on animals in the Third Reich, dogs and wolves were constantly invoked by Nazis as models for the qualities they wanted to cultivate, including loyalty, hierarchy, courage, obedience, and sometimes even cruelty. Instrumentalized for the purposes of work, dogs were used by soldiers on front lines for tracking and guarding prisoners, among other things, while inside camps they helped instill fear in and increase compliance among prisoners. Indeed, dogs were often used to kill prisoners on command, and on occasion were even set on Jews for entertainment. Beyond such contexts, dogs were kept as companions by Nazis, including by Hitler himself. Not only did Hitler famously cultivate a close companionship with a female German shepherd named Blondie, who you can see on screen, but he had himself photographed with hounds with systematic consistency in order to humanize his public image. The elevated place of dogs as valued pets, as well as working animals within the Nazi imaginary, not only demonstrates the complexity and paradoxical nature of Nazi positions on animals, but exemplifies the instability of Nazi ideas about race. As Michael Berlin observes, Nazi speciesism, defined as the recognition of rights on the basis of a group membership, rather than solely on the basis of moral considerations at the level of the individual creature, demonstrates the similar treatment of humans and animals by Nazi Germany. Rather than reflecting an elevated level of animal care, the exceptional place of dogs as pets in Nazi ideology owed more to a respect for certain patterns of behavior and survival. This is made plain by Nazi attempts to purge so-called Jewish dogs, not only those owned by Jews, but those manifesting inferior or feminized traits, rhetorically associated with Jews as a biologically inferior race. In addition to foregrounding the Herz benevolence towards dogs, which typify idealized German traits then, Diller's privileged place highlights the precarity of Jewish lives, again, beyond the wall of the camp. Rudolph's petting of Diller at the garden party serves as a counterpart to another human-animal encounter mirroring this one stylistically. After the party is ended and Hedwig has chastised her husband for threatening to uproot their comfortable lives at Auschwitz, Rudolph visits his unnamed horse at night in the stable and speaks to it in a rare and intimate moment of vulnerability. Wearing the same monochromatic white suit, he rests his forehead against that of the black horse, rehearsing the earlier black and white motif, and utters emphatically, "This must be hard for you too. Don't you think I know that? I love you, my beauty." Rudolph's explicit adoration of this horse, on which he is pictured riding around the outskirts of the camp throughout the film, appears to affirm that this is no evil perpetrator, but rather a man for whom signing off on the mass killing of Jews goes hand in hand with his love and respect for particular lives, including those of domesticated and working animals. In fact, the commandant's affection for animals serves as a recurrent motif in his autobiography. Penned from a Polish prison as he awaited his execution in April 1947, in the memoir, Herz emphasizes his love of animals and of dogs and horses in particular. Writing nostalgically about his childhood, he recalls a period after resettling in Mannheim at the age of 6, thus: "My mother often told me how, for weeks on end, I was almost ill with homesickness for my animals and my hills and my forest." This is Herz. In the same passage, he mentions receiving Hans, a coal-black pony with sparkling eyes and a long mane, for his 7th birthday. Quite a birthday gift at the age of 7. The horse in the zone of interest not only resembles Hans, but is able to temper Rudolph's anxieties as a source of comfort, reflecting the commandant's affinity with the animal at times over and above his family. This reliance on particular animal subjects for solace is emphasized in the commandant's account of his time in Auschwitz later in the memoir, in which he notes, "If I was deeply affected by some incident in the camp, I found it impossible to go back to my home and my family. I would mount my horse and ride until I had chased the terrible picture away. Often at night, I would walk through the stables and seek relief among my beloved animals." I have like 1 page left, so maybe we good for time? Okay. Sorry, I feel like I've been talking for hours, so I can only imagine how you feel. Okay. Okay. So drawing a clear distinction between human animals, The suggestion here seems to be that only a retreat to animals who are unable to communicate can help to relieve Rudolph's anxieties pertaining to mass killing operations. It is as though he finds in them a surrogate family removed from any sense of accountability. For neither Dilla nor the horse on screen can protest their involvement in assuaging the guilt of their owner, despite the kinds of metaphorical or gestural protestations analysed earlier in relation to the dog. So the scratching of the door, for example. The healing power of some animals extends to the film's extra-diegetic context, with Huller reflecting in an interview, the same interview from which I quoted before, to be loved by a creature while playing this character was really soothing and important for me. So there's this kind of constant interplay and entanglement between the diegetic and the extra-diegetic that I'm really fascinated by. Here, Rudolph's elevated consideration for and kinship with animals becomes a tool with which he seems to want to articulate something recuperative about himself. Namely, that he is capable of sensitivity and compassion, even if this is reserved only for animal species. Yet any semblance of humanity is undercut by the indifference with which he talks about some incident in the camp. Presumably a reference for violence, the details and victims of which remain absent from his memoir. What's more, this love of animals doesn't encompass all species. Rather, both Glazer's film and the commandant's memoir speak to the construction of a non-human animal hierarchy, which exemplifies biologically deterministic Nazi ideas about race. This hierarchy at times privileges and at others dehumanizes Dilla, whose space is delimited by her owners and whose behavior they attempt to control in the film. As pet and animal witness to genocidal suffering, audiences are denied visual access to. The dog thus emerges as an ambiguous, more than human subject who exposes the arbitrary distinctions between the lives of humans that do and do not matter in the film. Brought into ethical relation with victims, Dilla opens audiences up to a different kind of ethical sensibility or responsiveness that is not contingent on human conceptions of witnessing. In doing so, she exemplifies the roles of animal lives in Holocaust texts beyond metaphors for the morality of humans and muddies the very legibility of the human as a basis for the humane. Moving beyond the metaphorical instrumentalization of animals, Glazer's film thus intervenes within the ways in which animal subjects are conventionally used and conceptualized within Holocaust representation. And this, in turn, encourages us to question the unjustified, untenable, and unproductive animal-human divide, which, as Helena Duffy and David Tolleton argue, formed the very basis for the exclusion of certain communities from under the protective umbrella of humanity during the Holocaust. So to conclude then, this talk has sought to consider how the register of horror, in addition to audiovisual engagements with animal subjects and animal aesthetics in Holocaust films, complicate and offer generative alternatives to conventional forms of Holocaust memory in the post-witness era. Challenging the largely humanist lens of Holocaust representation, the Cremator and the Zone of Interest illuminate the value of more than human approaches to depicting anti-Jewish violence, which disturb conceptions of humanity and complicate, as I've said, tried to hammer home perhaps a bit too much, the boundaries between good and evil, victim and perpetrator, and human and animal on screen. Albeit in different ways, both films recuperate horror, I think, as a serious and subversive artistic mode of representing the Holocaust. So far removed, I think, from the Nazi exploitation examples I showed you on screen, not only offering uniquely dark and transgressive commentaries on the legacy of Jewish murder and persecution in Czechoslovakia and Poland, respectively, but establishing a less anthropocentric ethics of creaturely life. Taken together, these films suggest that artistic engagements with the Holocaust must be understood beyond strictly anthropocentric parameters, not only because art is itself derived from animal impulses, as Carrie Roman argues, but due to the shared logics with which some human and animal lives are marginalized and deemed killable by those in positions of power. Despite the complicated and at times ambivalent ethical implications of the animalization of Jews to encode anti-Semitism in the Cremator and the privileging of particular animals over Jewish subjects in the Zone of Interest, these films ultimately offer new ways of conceptualizing paradigms of Holocaust memory and witnessing beyond the human. Okay, I'm done.
I think we can stop the sharing now, and we can start with a question and answer session. And we'll start with people here. I mean, Emily is going to share the discussions now. Yes, yes, and you can see now, you know, people
Great.
online.
Yeah, I was going to say I can't see online, but I can.
Yeah, we just open up the.
Just open up.
It's a bit uncanny to see your face online.
Yeah.
It's interesting because
There we go. No, I can see now. It's fine. I just
Okay.
need to see
Okay.
if anyone posts anything. That's just a comment from me.
Okay, no worries.
Normally it should be showing, but I don't know why it's stopping the. It may be because we got the let's.
I'm happy to not have my face projected twice.
No, but it is it's a good idea to check that. What happens? Yeah, let's.
I interesting. I'm invited to hear, but I'm now going to have to watch Zone of Interest again because I confess I didn't notice the dog really.
Yeah.
So when you said
Same here.
yeah, when
Yeah,
you
yeah.
said people kind of
Yeah,
cut
yeah.
the dog out and don't really think, I think you opened my eyes to an entirely different way of watching that film.
Yeah.
I'm going to have
You
to
can.
return to it.
Here and Emily, if you can come a little closer
Yeah.
there, so you appear both of you there.
So blurred. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, that's interesting, but I think that's a common, what is interesting to me is that I've seen so much online about sort of horticultural responses to the zone of interest. So that, you know, there's been a lot about, sorry, I know this wasn't explicitly a question, so I'm sorry to
Please.
but there seems to have been a lot written about ecology in the film and about the cultivation of the garden, and it's linked to Lebensraum, but the animals often go without mention, which is interesting to me. And I think there's a reluctance in Holocaust studies, but also beyond Holocaust studies, to engage with animal lives because there's a fear of reductive comparisons, I think, between Jewish prisoners and animal, which is a very fair concern, I think. So there has to be, you know, a real level of nuance, I think, to any deconstruction of the role of animals in Holocaust films. But yeah, I was interested also that people tended not to notice the
Because I'm sorry, I'm going to open this up in 1 second, but I'm far more familiar with animal as metaphor, rather than animal as witness. Or,
like mouse or
exactly. So it really changed my thinking on how I am reading those films. I was really interested to know, and I am going to open this, but I'm really interested to know. Or I was really interesting to think about how the dog never existed in reality.
Yeah.
But it was a tortoise.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that character wouldn't work, I don't think, as a tortoise in the same. I mean, if I didn't notice a dog, I'm definitely not noticing a tortoise. But it is interesting that that role has to be played by a dog in a sense. And that's got me thinking, I think. So, question.
Can I just follow up that?
Yeah.
That scene in Zone of Interest when the dog scratching at the door.
Mhm.
I remember that.
Yeah.
That was quite unsettling, and that didn't work in terms of exactly how you portrayed it. But I think you're saying that wasn't set up; that just happened.
Yeah. So the dog is untrained.
Yeah. Yes.
And apparently Glazer was actually quite happy that the dog seemed to kind of disrupt the kind of order of things. And I don't know, because it's impossible to say really, because it's a dog, whether Glazer was on the other side, you know, trying to, or that, I don't know to what extent that was set up. And what I assume is that not Dilla, because Sandra Huller never gives the name of her dog. She's sort of weirdly private about the dog.
I got the impression it's her dog.
Yeah. So it's her pet in real life.
The dog would have followed her.
Yeah. So the dog doesn't know what it's not seeing, and yet it still works as a kind of commentary on. I'm drawing attention to this moment of complicity and this moment of insidiousness, and I'm just fascinated that in the film, I'm fascinated by the fact that Hedwig cares enough to shut out the dog. So she's not only shutting out the housemaids and the other people in the house, she's shutting out the dog. And you know, what does that say about how she feels about the dog? And it's she's concerned with what the dog might think of her, the dog's own projections onto her. I'm really, yeah, it's really fascinating to me, because also other times in the movie she sort of shouts at the dog. She's telling her where to go, she's telling her what to do. She gets annoyed when she's barking, but there is this kind of creeping concern that maybe the dog is more of a moral agent than we might imagine. I think. Yeah.
I mean, it's more fascinating now. I found it at the time. I find it quite edgy. And secondly, the dog scratching at the door and the discomfort. But now it's even more interesting that may or may not be planned.
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing that was important to me, is that I've been trying to read all I can about dogs and the Holocaust, and I've been doing a lot of reading of Levinas's essay, in which don't know if people are familiar, where Levinas talks about his encounter with a dog called Bobby in a prisoner of war camp. And in the essay, he's talking about the fact that the dog can't be an ethical agent because he cannot speak and he can't rationalize. However, I wanted to kind of remove my analysis from, is the dog a moral agent, and think more about, well, regardless of whether or not the dog is a moral agent, is still engaged in the politics of seeing and witnessing, and us paying attention to that alternative non-human politics of witnessing and seeing can potentially draw attention to other less obvious, less apparent dynamics of watching and of complicity and collaboration. Yeah.
Thanks. Very interesting. I thought my background is not in Holocaust, but colonial and post-colonial perspective. And I was interested, especially, so there's going to be a fair question, a bit unfair question, because
that's fine. That's fine. Throw them at me.
So I'll go with the unfair first, and then the fair one, which I'm sure you'll know about first. The unfair one is, I was interested when you were talking about the animalistic aspect. And again, when I say unfair, it's because, of course, you look through the lenses of the Holocaust and, of course, conflicts. But the animalistic representation is something that is not just with genocide, also with colonial genocide, of course, perspectives. And I'm thinking about this idea of being tamed or being brutal as an animal and so on, that being used from the late 19th century onwards to represent colonial people. And especially when it comes with very much racial divisions and the idea of the martial race at the end of the 19th century. These are the soldiers and so martial race that are meant to be, as you were mentioning with the dogs, like the German shepherds, this idea that these dogs are trained, so they, you can rely on them, they are specific. And you have that already at the end of the 19th century when it comes to Indians, people under 6, for example. But then you have also those who you cannot train, or they just have to be behind bars, like in the zoo from the first film, something like that. So what I'm saying is unfair because I don't know if you know other films outside the Holocaust type of movies that also use this kind of animalistic representation in cinema, because they are definitely in all the cultural mediums from the late 19th century onwards when it comes to the colonial perspectives. So, as I say, it's a bit unfair. If you cannot understand that,
I mean, the short answer is no. It's one I can think on, and perhaps come up with some suggestions. The short answer is no. The longer answer is that, firstly, it's a really good question. And one of the reasons it's also a really relevant question for what I'm doing is because, you know, our ideas of what the horror genre constitutes in the West is shaped by Western ideas of horror, but actually horror in the Gothic comes from colonial history, right? Or has been colonized. So like Haiti, ghosts in Haiti, and folklore surrounding the zombie, which is initially a Haitian word, right? Is really relevant here because the colonial actually really underpins the horror genre in a way that we're not really familiar with in the West. So that's a really good question and one that I would like to explore, but I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you. But good point.
More fair one. And what was the reception, especially the first film, reception by Jewish community?
But that's also a really excellent question. I thought your question was just going to be about reception, but it's more specific than that. Again, the short answer is, in terms of Jewish community specifically, I'm not sure. It definitely had a very mixed reaction. I looked at a review from when a screening of the film just after the fall of communism, which described completely mixed reactions in a room. Some were horrified, some left partway through, which is fair enough. It's quite a disturbing film, and others really enjoyed it. But what's really interesting, and again, this isn't really answering your question, I'm sorry, but what's really interesting is that over the last 5 years, the film has really enjoyed a renaissance. All of a sudden, there's like loads written online about the Cremator from, like, I say loads, not loads, but there's more. A BFI piece was written about it in, I think, 2024. There's a new Criterion version of the film. I think the whole Czechoslovak new wave, more accurately, is undergoing a bit of a renaissance, and these Jewish-centered films, but also films made by Jews at a time where it was completely unprecedented in, during the Soviet era, is really interesting. But I don't know about the Jewish community in particular, because, and it's a really good question as well, because he is a Jewish film director. Yeah.
Can I just get a point of clarity on what year that film was released?
1969. Yeah.
So that means that the first preview was like 30 years later in the West. That means that it was not shown in the West until 30 years later.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So again, these are great questions, and they are pointing out to me that I haven't necessarily done my homework as I should have. But yeah, it was banned in the Soviet Union from 1974 to 89. I'm not sure at what point the film reaches the West. I don't know if that's the first screening.
So this is peculiar. I mean, it was banned in the Soviet Union almost like 5 years after it was released.
Yeah.
And it was not shown in the West until the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Well, I don't know if that's the first time it's shown in the West. The responses I was just talking about are from the Czech Republic, the former Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure at what point it reaches the West, but yeah. But yeah,
It looks horrific, I will say.
Yeah.
but
it's interesting
now I'm
that it
very
was in
interested to
some
see
way
it.
banned and restricted immediately both sides of the in the whole world, essentially. On the other hand, I wonder, because I have a Hispanic background and I'm in Argentina, and there was a lot of screening of Czechoslovakian movies in Buenos Aires, and I wonder if actually might have been shown in Buenos Aires before the fall of the Berlin Wall, because we used to receive movies from the Soviet Union directly. There was even a cinema exclusively showed. So now
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one, and I should find out as well, because I'm not sure to what extent films were exported during that time. And it's interesting as well because there's this window, so it's not banned immediately. It's banned after. So
I guess
that's a really good point.
Yeah, I guess that's as conversations kind of emerge from not just that film, but films of that type. That's when they get banned later, isn't it? Essentially, it's sparking a conversation that they don't want to have. So then it comes on. We have got a question online. If you want to unmute yourself and ask, please. Thank you.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I thought that was really fascinating. Just quickly, kind of regarding the chronology of your research.
Wait a second, because we cannot hear you.
I can't actually find your speakers here, Graciela.
Yeah, that's,
sorry, 1 second.
Yeah.
Ian.
Yeah, that's okay.
it should be here. Actually, it's in 96, so I don't understand.
Okay,
It's
I'll-
100.
I will. It's coming out of your speakers. Say again, Ian, and I'll translate.
That's good. Yeah, so thank you very much for the talk. I thought that's fascinating. Regarding the kind of how your research has developed, I'm just kind of curious, when you first watched Zone of Interest, which I imagine was when it was released a couple of years ago, was your kind of theories fully formed? So were you watching it thinking, oh my God, this is everything I've been writing about? Or did you watch it kind of and come away thinking that was odd? And did it kind of lead you to kind of form your theories?
Yeah, that's.
So the
Oh,
question,
sorry.
no, I'm just going to say. So the question is around whether or not you've come to the zone of interest with your thoughts, or whether your thoughts have emerged from watching the zone of interest.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because my my thoughts as they do have definitely developed since doing this film. Yes, so I have to say that I have been engaged in thinking about paradigms of eco-memory, eco-witnessing for a while. And I think I pretty much immediately was struck in the film by the entanglement of horror with the use of flora and fauna. And initially, I didn't really have space to talk about it here because I was talking mostly about the figure of the animal. But, you know, and I assume you've seen the film, but the moments in the film where the film kind of strays from its hyperrealism, you know, where we get the close up on a dahlia, red dahlia, and it fills the screen, and this very disturbing soundtrack, or the infrared sequence, this very dreamlike sequence where there's a planting of apples for prisoners. These moments seem to me to be the moments where the film's kind of horror was kind of crystallized around elements of the natural world. And at the time I was thinking about the cremator, and I was thinking about the figure of the animal. So I'm trying to think if I've answered your question correctly. Yes, I guess I was coming to this with those kinds of ideas in mind, but I didn't know that the film was going to do what it was doing so much with landscapes and with the garden and with flora and fauna. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Yes.
Slight tangent. It started off with the Poles in rural Poland attacking the Jews in 1941 or something.
Yeah.
I seem to recall many years ago watching a documentary, which at least included in that book, so I can't remember, attacks on returning Jews after the end of the war.
Yeah.
Has that been covered in film or literature or?
There is a yes. Not I haven't seen any sort of representational literature about it, but I think there's a documentary about the Glazer pogrom in 1946, which is so that might be what it is.
Sounds like an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Or film or fiction.
Yeah, for sure. And actually it's still an interesting topic because there are still so many dispossessed homes that have yet to be returned, and there's still so much kind of local knowledge. But it's still, I mean, less so with I guess that there's kind of, it's a complicated one, but I guess since the change of government in Poland, there's a slightly different kind of officialized memory politics in that sense, but there's still a lot of sort of memory work to be done. And that, you know, that the same is true for kind of textual and filmic representations. But it's really interesting that that Polish film that I mentioned and a couple of other Polish films that I looked at in my PhD, they all emerged from like within maybe 3 or 4 years of one another, and form part of this kind of cultural movement in Poland, renaissance of kind of Polish engagements with the Polish Jewish past. It's fascinating. Yeah.
I do have just something I want to ask. If there are no more questions here or online. I think you have made me kind of want to go back and watch it through a different lens. And I wondered how you came to that lens yourself. Like what inspired you to think about kind of decentering the human, I guess, in that? And I can understand how you may face kind of critics, not just with your work, with things that you're reading and immersing yourself in as well, thinking about taking Holocaust representation away from the human. But it is something, I think it's something really worthwhile looking at, because it tells us so much about the human experience as well. And I know you're decentering that, but that's kind of where my head goes.
But it works both ways.
Yeah, what brought you to that? Like what kind of inspired that research?
It's a really good question. And yeah, you're right that, you know, I think that there's a collection of essays maybe from a couple of years ago about like increased turns to the environmental humanities and Holocaust studies. And I think I remember Omar Bartov wrote something about like we must reinstate the human, it's really interesting because I think I quoted from Helen Duffy and David Taunton's special issue, which came out just last year on the increased presence of nature in Holocaust studies. So it's definitely something that's happening. It's kind of like a turn. It's happening. How I came to it, I guess I was always have always been interested in representations of the environment and the in Holocaust texts, particularly because, so for context, my PhD is about literature and memory of the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. And many of the texts and films I was looking at were very much about the natural environment, precisely because they were about extra concentrationary forms of killing. So they weren't forms of killing that were happening within the confines of concentration camps. They were often happening in killing fields and ravines. And so necessarily there was often an engagement with the natural world, precisely because it formed the kind of spatialities of the testimonies and experiences and stuff. And when you're researching and you start seeing something everywhere, that kind of happened. I kept seeing it everywhere, and I thought there must be something about this. There must be something about this. There must be, and
there's more to know. Yeah,
there's more to know.
Yeah,
and in camps, lots of times with survivor testimonies, they talk about the natural world, deriving solace from the natural world, from birds, from trees, and especially, Tim Cole talks about this a lot in his work, about the fact that natural landscapes like forests, for example, provided protection and camouflaging of prisoners, but they also the natural world could also expose them and the manhunts that took place in those spaces. So they're really complicated spaces as well. And I'm really interested in the fact that on the one hand I'm going on.
No, it's your space.
But I'm really interested in the fact that on the one hand you had these kinds of representations of the landscape, but on the other there's like a real scientific underpinning to it. So Eva Domanska, Polish historian, has done a lot of work to do with detecting bioindicators in the soil in places like Poland, where there are decomposing remains, and how those remains irrevocably change the DNA of the soil, of the plants that grow from the soil, of the animals that eat from. So there are these whole ecologies that are linked to Jewish murder and persecution. I think it's quite a useful tool in the post-witness era, where we have to move away from relying on first-hand testimony, right? And start thinking about, especially in an era of climate degradation, and start thinking about how kind of different kinds of human and non-human violence kind of fit together. Sorry, it's very long-winded.
No, it's so interesting. I'm certain we could talk about it all day. But sorry, go on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add something there.
There was a lot of interesting flora, the fauna, as it were. Why do you think that is? It's just more noticeable, or just more powerful, or?
Perhaps, I think possibly in the zone of interest because of the very striking visual juxtaposition of the camp wall and the kind of brutality of what it looks like, and the green. It's a very saturated film in terms of the color. And actually, the slide's gone, but actually, I don't know if you saw the real image of the Herz family. The garden is actually much less cultivated than it is in the film. And that image, the trees and everything is actually much more overgrown. And the film has really honed in on the garden as a cultivated, manicured space, presumably as a means of saying something about the idea of Lebensraum and the manicuring of this one space so close to the camp. And I think also people don't know what to do with animals. Especially because it's a tricky one kind of performatively. With a human witness, you can know much more about them and how they see the world. With an animal witness, it's always projection and speculation. And I think maybe that puts people off. But I was really angry, actually. I was trying for so long to find this still with Dilla in it, and people kept cutting her out, and I was really cross.
That'll be very annoying.
But it's yeah.
The flora that has been put in order by humans, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And the fauna is slightly under less control.
Yeah. And then it speaks to your first question of, you know, why a dog? You know, the dog and the horse, they're very chivalric animals, which in a sense serve to kind of heighten the civility of the Herz family and the you know, the perpetrators.
Does it play a domestic role? Because I was just scribbling down some notes while you were talking, because like I said, it's such a thing. For me, the dog as an animal is so domesticated and so that kind of awful man's best friend kind of trope, in a way that other animals aren't. And same with the horse as well. These things, maybe that does feed a little bit into that idea of control as well. That these are highly controlled animals in that sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is why I felt like a tortoise wouldn't quite. It's far more wild in that sense.
They're highly controlled, but they're also, I guess, some of the closest domesticated species we have that are intelligent. You know, people always talk about how intelligent dogs and horses are. So there's also a
interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
No.
We are.
I'm very happy to stop talking.
We are out of time. But thank you everyone online that joined us. And thank you everyone in the room for your questions as well. We've had a great time. Thank you.
I'm glad I didn't put anyone to sleep.
No, it's such an interesting
Yes.
area.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll close here and the